Again, welcome to all of you who are viewing this. We are reaching you from Union Baptist Church, and we are excited to be able to share a conversation with you with Chief Justice Cheri Beasley, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. For those of you who may not know you as well as others, Chief Justice, tell us a little bit about who Cheri Beasley is, in your own words, however you want to fill in that blank. Who's Cheri Beasley?
Well, I am the Chief Justice, and I'm a wife and a mother, and a community person and a friend. I'm married to Curtis, and we're the very proud parents of twin sons, Matthew and Thomas, who are 19-year-old college students. I'm a judge, and I have served as a jurist now for 21 years, and it's hard for me to believe. Serving in our trial courts in the district court in Fayetteville for 10 years in all of our courts, on the Court of Appeals for 4 years, and on the Supreme Court for 7. And I've served as the Chief Justice for the last year and a half. I am a member of First Baptist Church in Raleigh, where I'm also on the Board of Trustees.
That's an amazing career and certainly a beautiful family. And I've heard you mention a few different layers of judicial service. Help us by just giving an overview of how the judiciary works and how it's structured in North Carolina.
Well, the Supreme Court of North Carolina is the highest court in the state. And then the next level down is the Court of Appeals. And then the next levels are trial courts. And we have superior courts and district courts. And remember, we have a federal system and a state system. So we know that there's a Supreme Court of the United States, which is a part of the federal system. And then the Supreme Court of North Carolina is the highest court in the state.
So the Supreme Court of North Carolina has sort of the final word in those cases that are heard on a state level. Is that I'm sure it's an oversimplification, but
no, you're almost there. It has the final say on state law and state constitutional matters. If there are matters that involve the federal laws or the federal constitution, those cases may be appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Okay, yeah. And you have the honor and the privilege of being the second African-American to serve as Chief Justice and the first African-American woman to serve as Chief Justice of North Carolina. So we do celebrate that, and certainly we are grateful for the role that you've played. When you think about this election, and I know a lot of the headlines right now are focusing on the national election, but we obviously have some very important races like yours on the state level. What makes this election year critical for North Carolinians? What's at stake if voters stay home?
Well, we keep hearing that this is the most important election of our lives. I personally think that every election is the most important election of our lives. When we think about how people literally died and gave their lives for us to have the right to vote, when we think about the fact that in many areas, at least legally, African-American women gained the right to vote in 1965, although we know that the application of those laws did not take effect for decades, really. And even the passage of the right to vote in North Carolina for all women did not happen until 1971. Every election is important. And so when we think about the sacrifices, every election is important, but I do think it's important that this year's election is consequential. Justice is on the ballot. And when George Floyd died and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, I was the first Chief Justice in the nation to make a public statement acknowledging the validity of the rallying cry that we heard across the state of North Carolina and around this nation. It was important to me to acknowledge that as we saw people protesting across the state and standing against racial disparities in corporations and governmental entities, that it was important to me as the Chief Justice to acknowledge that there are racial disparities in our court system as well. And so when people believe that there are two kinds of justice, it's not just a belief. We have the data to support that there are disparate outcomes in our courts. And so I think the Chief Justice really must lead courageously and boldly to make changes through the court system. And remember, the Chief Justice leads the Supreme Court of North Carolina, and she also leads the entire judicial branch of government. So where there are courts all over the state, I lead all of those courts, and I also oversee the budget for all of our courts. And so it's an important position, and it's important for us to understand the qualifications and the experience of those of us who offer ourselves for service in this way. And we have for far too long, not just in our courts, but in many ways, not talked about race. We've not acknowledged this very difficult history in North Carolina. And I don't think we can go forward properly without doing that, including in our courts. And I think we've got to acknowledge biases, implicit and otherwise. And we've got to determine for ourselves that our courts will not have disparate outcomes, that there must be true justice in all of the cases that come before the courts. And I think the Chief Justice really has the responsibility to lead in those efforts.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. That it is it leads to this other question, which is, are you aware, because I guess with some of the social protests and social unrest that we've seen over this year, just in particular, there's been a lot of talk about ways to reform the legal system, ways to reform law enforcement. Are you aware of current models or policies or proposals even that might bring about real reform in the relationship between law enforcement and, say, historically marginalized demographics? Or what ideas could we be thinking about as a state?
I think it's admirable that Governor Roy Cooper has developed this task force on racial inequities in the criminal justice system. I think it will largely focus on a number of areas, but on policing, and I think that's hugely important. The Supreme Court of North Carolina has also created a commission on fairness and equality, and it's really important that courts acknowledge that there are some disparities. I am certain that the Courts Commission will work closely with the Governor's Commission in implementing some changes. But I also know that it's important for us to be mindful that while we focus on the criminal justice system, that we have a civil justice system as well, where there are also disparities. And when we think about juvenile justice, whether it's a young person getting in trouble or at the hands of abuse, neglect, and dependency, that's civil justice. When we think about custody and other kinds of family issues, that's civil justice. When we think about evictions and summary ejectment, that's civil justice. And so it's important for us to be, as the leader of the courts, holistic about our approach and the disparities of cases that come before our courts. And so I'm excited about the fact that we've had great responses from court leaders, many of whom have said, I knew we needed to do something, I just didn't know what. So I'm thankful that we've begun to move forward with really critical but very difficult conversations, acknowledging those disparities and working together to determine how best to move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Speaking of moving forward, a lot of maybe more progressively minded people are struggling with how the U.S. Supreme Court will move forward without the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In what ways has her death, is it playing a role in this election? And how will the Supreme Court play a role in this current political moment and even beyond?
It's interesting. Justice Ginsburg was actually in Raleigh about a year ago, and she came to visit students at Meredith College and spent the day there. And in the evening, she greeted about 300 people in downtown Raleigh to talk about her life, to talk about growing up and her work on the Supreme Court and her romance with her husband. And even when she graduated from law school, number one in her class in Columbia, how she could not find a job because she was a woman. And she worked really hard for women's rights throughout her entire life, and certainly for equal justice for all people. I do think that her passing has helped people appreciate the importance of courts overall. I think it's brought greater attention to the importance of the Supreme Court of the United States, and then I think necessarily of all courts. And I think that's hugely important. And she never minced her words. And one of the quotes she's known for is fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way where others will follow. And I think when we think about the imperative nature of this moment, when we think about how important these elections are, we really must take heed. And while we know that there has been protest around racial disparities and injustice, and that's hugely important in moving conversations forward, peaceful protest can be very valuable in changing the course of dialogue and changing the course of justice, not just in courts, but overall. But we don't finish the job if people don't also vote. It is the most important way that people can determine for themselves who will serve them. North Carolina has the third longest ballot in the nation. And it's important folks will know what they want to do at the top of it. They're going to know who they want to vote for president. But it is so important that they go to the bottom of that ballot and make it all the way down, because every single person who is offering themselves for service and every person who's ultimately elected will be working in a way that our lives are affected in every single day of our lives in ways we may not even be able to imagine. So it is so important to make informed decisions about voting. And once we do that, there's an amazing sense of empowerment around exercising the right to vote.
So speaking of that, exercising the right to vote, in the 2016 general election, generations Y and Z cast about 70 million votes, which was a slight majority of the total number of votes cast, and which was a pretty significant uptick from the way they voted, the numbers of votes they cast that those two generations cast in the 2008 election. How do you think we can continue to motivate younger adults, people coming, first-time voters because of age or engagement? How can we continue to motivate their involvement? And this may be even through the church or just what you're seeing out on the campaign trail. Do you see them engaged this time around as much as in previous years?
Well, we know we still have some days left in early voting through October 31st, and then of course on November the 3rd. Certainly young people, it's a little bit more difficult to be engaged in some ways because we're not coming together in the same ways.
Right.
You know, normally about this time of the year on college campuses, folks would be, have all kinds of activities and rallies to encourage people to vote, and there would be a whole level of excitement and enthusiasm that's a little bit difficult to duplicate. But I'm so grateful that young people are so incredibly intelligent, and they get it. I mean, they really do understand the impact of their voices, probably in a way that prior generations didn't, because they also have the benefit of the fight and the struggle of the generations who've come before them. But there is a level of enthusiasm and excitement that we've not really seen in a long time. And the church always has a role. The church historically has had a role, not just in our political lives, but in our, the church has always been the hub of our social lives, in our political lives, in our community lives, in our familial lives. And so, when we want the greatest advice about what we ought to care about, what the issues are for our families and for our communities, we always listen to the pastor. And that really hasn't changed in African-American churches. We still look to the pastors for leadership in these regards. And we know that model really is biblically based about how we think about our role and activity in communities and our obligation to serve in this way. So the church for so many African Americans remains critical as a hub of information. I mean, so many people are still going to need to know about early voting, need to know the rules around mail-in ballots, need to know the rules around, casting a vote on election day, not on the Monday before, because we've had 2 weeks of early voting. I mean, there's such a wealth of information. And also, I hope everybody knows that they can find their actual ballot, a sample ballot, at ncsbe.gov. And you can find voter lookup, go to sample ballot, and find the ballot for your district. And you will see every single person offering ourselves for service up and down the ballot. And you can be thoughtful about those decisions before you go to the polls. So all of that is so important, but so much of that voter education always comes from our churches. So much of how we think about issues and how we think about how those issues that present themselves relate to our families, and our communities often comes from the churches. So that has always been, and I think it will continue to be.
Powerful words, inspiring words from Chief Justice Cheri Beasley, also candidate for Chief Justice this year, and we're grateful for your time. Any concluding thoughts that you want to share with the audience today?
You know, this has been a challenging year. We are in the midst of a pandemic. So many of our family members and our communities members have faced real challenges around this pandemic. And all of that is compounded by heightened racial tensions in our communities and protests and so much more. And it's usually in times of challenge, and we've been deeply challenged, that we understand, and the book of Romans tells us that we have to have the challenges and that we must persevere. And we have to have the hope, because you don't get to the successes and the victory without the challenges. You don't even appreciate them. And so we've got to think about what's grounded in the upbringing of our families, what's grounded in our history. When we vote, we need to take with us all of that, and take very seriously the obligation to vote in this election. I am certainly asking for everybody's prayers and their support and their vote on November 3rd. And I am super excited about this year and all the blessings that it will bring.
We are so thankful for your time, for these amazing words and insights, and we wish you all the best in your campaign. Very best to you and your family.
Thank you, Pastor Rivers. Good to see you.